Good afternoon, welcome to the first seminar of 2013 in this series, co-sponsored by the Education Employers Task Force and the Centre for Education and Industry at the University of Warwick. We're delighted today to welcome from the University of the West of England Professor Richard Waller and Dr. Neil Harrison, who are presenting on work experience. Who's going to go first?
It's me actually, so I'll kick us off if that's okay. So just a quick overview of what we're going to be looking at. Can everybody see the screen? Excellent. First of all, very quick romp through the policy context here, and then a discussion around the wider study from which these data are drawn. Looking at then the profile of the placements, some definitions of key terms, and then also moving on to 4 particular case studies of young people that we spoke to in the course of this particular piece of research. Going through a bit of theory and then into some conclusions and some questions that we have for the future, which hopefully will then act as a spur for discussion in the second half of this session. So, you probably know most of this, but just so that we're clear on our terms, work experience as a compulsory element for those people pursuing the national curriculum starts in 1994, Key Stage 4. So you've got this phenomenon that's been around for approaching 20 years, but very unclear policy objectives. And we did, as part of this work, we did a little bit of analysis around what the actual objectives of work experience are for young people. And lots of different ideas from different government documents at different periods in time. So preparation for work, widening horizons, sampling jobs, increasing motivation for school, building maturity and resilience, and attaching people back into school, making school culturally relevant for young people. But where that confusion has been most pronounced is around those young people who are at the higher end of the academic spectrum, for whom the entry into the employment market is not likely to occur at 16 or probably even 18, because they're on the trajectory that's going to take them into level 3 study and potentially into higher education as well. And a very unclear set of rationales there for why these young people at the age of 14, 15, 16 are being asked to do work experience. And the growth of part-time employment for young people, for teenagers, has made this even more tenuous because so many of them are getting real-life work experience through Saturday jobs, evening jobs and so on, that actually the idea of a 2-week artificial placement perhaps doesn't quite add up. We took 2 other particular perspectives on this as well, looking at particularly this high-achieving, higher academic group. A quote there from the Milburn report into social mobility. Government should undertake a radical overhaul of work experience, better aligned with people's careers and decision making. Of course, this report is around access to professions. So this is about young people being able to move up through the social class barriers and into professional contexts. And then a report by someone called Mann, who looked at university as entry into university and how work experience actually helps to do that, and pointing out that it's not well understood by policymakers. There is a role, there is a connection there. Looking at how work experience helps to see and play that role in university admissions as well. So in 2012 this compulsion is removed and the focus has now shifted to Key Stage 5. Now the people we're going to be talking about here did their work experience in about 2008-9, so it's prior to that period. Okay, so the study, it's a piece of work that we did now about 18 months ago, and we were looking at undergraduate students at a university not far from our own, in their first year, full-time young undergraduates, so aged under 21. So some of them had perhaps a couple of years out between school and university. And what we were particularly trying to do within the context of the wider study was to get a very representative sample of young people that were coming through this particular university, which happens to be typical in terms of its demographic mix, typical of the higher education sector as a whole. So it's quite a useful little area in which to do research in terms of gender, ethnicity, class mix, subject mix, and so forth. So we did 62 semi-structured interviews, lasting up to about an hour. And what we collected was some very rich data around their family background, educational trajectory, what their parents have done and grandparents have done in terms of occupations and education, but also looking at sort of material resources within the home as well, and looking at some of how social class is constructed within this particular context. So, for the particular data we're going to report today, we're dealing with a subset of that study with 49 individuals within it. Now those 49 were chosen because they were ones that had actually undertaken a work experience placement at key stage 4 or 5. The remaining 13 either couldn't remember whether they had or not, or were in a school outside of the national curriculum. What we then did was to extract the data that we got through those interviews about their own memories, about their work experience placements, which obviously had happened 2, 3 or 4 years previously, and link that data about their own family backgrounds to the data about their work experience placements. So it enabled us to sort of contextualise the experiences that young people were having against aspects of their own educational and social background. So what we've talked about is looking at the other end of the telescope, and previous studies of work experience, like the one by Hatcher and Legale, who I think did a seminar here a couple of years ago, they were looking at a Key Stage 4 cohort looking forwards. We're looking at a subset of Key Stage 4 cohort that went on to university and asking them to look backwards in time. And as I say, particularly these are academically successful young people, those who are on that trajectory into higher education, by definition, part of the 35-36% of young people that go on to HE by the time they're 21. We had a slight issue with this idea of retrospective rationality, and we tried to get beyond just very simple responses from the young people about, well, I did this because I wanted to do this. This idea of trying to make a narrative for why you made choices in the past. But what we were able to do, I think, is to contextualise this quite well within that journey. So that work experience formed part of a wider set of data that we were collecting about their school and the choices that they had made. And particularly, we asked them about how relevant their work experience was to the choices they then made about university and their own aspirations for mobility. So we asked them about what careers they were aspiring to after graduation, but also where they were going to be in 10 years' time and how their lives would be different from their parents' lives. So hopefully we've captured, within the case studies that Richard is going to talk about in a second, hopefully we've captured quite a rich scenario for each person about where they were going and how they've gotten there. So just to sort of set us off, we're just setting out some of the terms that we're going to use to give a little bit of a taster for some of the data before we go into more depth. There's a very wide variety of experiences reported, and one of the things that we did was to sort these into high quality and low quality. And now this is obviously somewhat arbitrary, but it gave us a tool for being able to see whether or not placements that the young person had done were likely to lead them towards graduate employment or not. Was it in a context in which graduates were employed? Was it in a context that was skilled or professional? Two contrasting quotes there, one from the Tourist Information Office. It was really boring. People just came in and go, can you tell me where the nearest toilets are? And I was like, that way. That was about it, really. Clearly a low quality experience for that young person. Conversely, at a television company, I won't read all this out, it was brilliant. Each day I got assigned to a different person. I was in the newsroom, seeing people getting filmed. Then we'd be out editing programs and going out onto a set. Clearly a very different experience for this young person. Those two sort of illustrate the spectrum of different placements that we saw in the course of this piece of research. Now, in between those, there were some more fuzzy lines, but this gives you an idea. So when we talk about high and low quality, this is what we're talking about. As I say, we collected a wider range of data about social class, and what we did with that data is we used quite a nuanced approach to combining different forms of data about parents' occupation, family experience of education, the material resources of the home, and so on, to allocate people into three class groups: a working class group and a middle class group, which self-explanatory, but also a mixed class group where there were aspects of both types of social class shown. Typically where one parent was in a professional role and another parent was in a non-professional role, or where there was particular material affluence within the home, but the home life itself was more of a working class character. So you'll hear us using those three definitions, and they're not unproblematic. And in the full paper that we produced out of this work, we problematized that a little bit more as well. We also had data on their home neighbourhood, and so we were able to contextualise the family within the context of the neighbourhood in which they lived as well. So moving on to the placements themselves, you'll see on the bottom here that there are a total of 54 from 49 individuals. So these are placements rather than individuals, although most people only have one placement, but some schools said we're going to do 1 week of this and 1 week of something else, so they can double count it. We can see here within the working class group there were 22 young people. Most common were in teaching, nursing, retail, office and admin up in this top half here. Obviously the numbers are very small, so we haven't done any statistics with them, but you get an idea about some patterns perhaps here in the data. Within the mixed class group, the largest group of these doing construction and engineering, which tended to be the types of families where the mixed class young people were coming from, so successful trade families. And then the middle class group, you see more of a collection here around arts and media, professions and science, and also office administration at the top there. So quite different profiles by class. And so numbers are small, so this is exploratory really. But we'll come back to that, some of those patterns a little bit more as we go forwards. But one thing that was really interesting was the source of the placements. Where did the young person get their placements from? The pie chart on the left here is drawn from a piece of work done by Hillich, Cox and Pike in 2001. And we looked at their data and carved up the pie into three sections here, with 44% of young people working through some form of external broker, like an education business partnership, 29 getting their placement through a school, 27% through their own efforts or the efforts of their family. If we look over here in the yellow pie, from our study, we find is there's a much higher proportion of young people getting their placements either through their own work or through that of their family. 59% here, which corresponds with this smaller chunk of 27% over here. And similarly, those working through a school or broker, 41% over here in our sample compared to 63% over here in this sample. So our sample of young undergraduates were much more likely to be getting their placements through their own efforts rather than through the efforts of either a school or an external broker. And we think that's quite significant in terms of what it says about agency for those young people. We'll look at that a little bit more. We come on to look at case studies in just a second. So quality and social class. 41% of the placements we looked at we assessed as being high quality. So just under half of them were high quality. And there was a relatively equal spread. So in previous work that's looked at the whole Key Stage 4 cohort, the high quality placements have tended to be predominantly found amongst middle class young people. That wasn't the case here. Much bigger spread between social classes. And in fact, low quality placements were just as likely to be found amongst middle class young people as working class young people. So there wasn't that same division. Where there was division, I alluded to this a second ago when I had the table on the screen, was the difference between the types of placement. So the work in the middle classes, there was much more around the teaching professions. So where they were getting high quality placements, they were in teaching, working within a nursery context, and other those types of contexts of sort of perhaps public sector and perhaps relatively low status within the professions, whereas middle class young people very much more predominant in the art, media and culture area and in the professions themselves, so solicitor, accountant, scientist, those types of areas of occupation. Let's say, just to stress again, these are small numbers, so we can't make hard and fast conclusions about that, but there did seem to be a difference here, a distinction between there was high and then there was even higher quality in terms of the placement that young people were getting. Over to you, Richard.
Thank you. Okay, as Neil said before, we've written this up. It's a paper that's about to appear in the Journal for Education and Work. We can give you a link to it, but we obviously go into more detail in terms of the theory and indeed the case studies as well in that. So we're looking briefly at 4 case studies here to illustrate some of the issues that as they arose. These are, as you'd imagine, these are pseudonyms, and we look at how the different trajectories and the way that the notion of work experience was employed is different across the 4 different case studies. So first of all, we're going to look at Mark, who is from a working class background and is studying computer science at university. Jane is from a middle class background and is working class background and studying biomedical science. Chris, middle class, studying graphic design, and Paul is from a mixed class background that Neil was talking about previously, who's studying biomedical science. And in some ways, he's perhaps the most interesting of the 4 case studies, as we'll see shortly. So these cases we saw as fairly typical, but obviously it's nuanced by the individual experience that the students themselves had. So first of all then, Mark, and we've characterised this best by the notion of thwarted ambitions. He's demonstrated an aptitude for computing throughout his towards the end of his school career, and he demonstrated agency. He was doing what he should have done. He sought relevant placements but got very little in the way of response. So he sent out letters, 3 or 4 places, didn't get a response, and then he suggested he didn't know what to do, so then someone facilitated a placement for him. Now, we asked this specifically, was this the sort of placement you wanted? And he was saying no, it wasn't quite his requirements. But he ended up, rather than computing, he was in what we characterised as a menial retail placement throughout school, and very little support was actually enjoyed from either the school or from any external organisation. Jane. So Jane's from the working class background again. She was ambitious in terms of wanting to be a vet, but unlike perhaps many people who end up in professions like that, she didn't have family links, so she didn't have the social networks upon which she could draw. So we asked who arranged the placement, and she found out it was going to be something she had to do. She had to take the initiative, and she demonstrated a high degree of personal agency in achieving the placement she wanted. Now, we found this useful, as Neil said. These work placements can be useful in terms of helping young people make choices, not just positive choices about what they do want to do, but also things that they don't want to do. It's a way of dipping a toe in the water. It also, presumably, as and when they come to apply for university, is something that they can then make something out of. So she chose against veterinary science in the end, and also we characterise her as having deliberately chosen a lower status university, and the type of university where in fact veterinary science is not offered. So if you remember, she's doing biomedical science, so it's not unrelated, but it's not about animals. Okay, Chris was one of the middle-class young people who's now studying graphic design. Again, this is an example of someone who had the social capital, the contacts, the family networks upon which he could draw. He said you can organise yourself something, or the school can help out, but the things they find, the things that he knew the school was likely to do wasn't the sort of thing he wanted to do. So instead he turned to his kind of social capital, family links. His dad knew the people who ran the company, and so he said, you can come along, gave you bits and bobs to do, and it was good. Now, this was seen as a useful placement for Chris. Again, perhaps one wonders if it's because this was arranged on a personal basis, whether more care may have been taken of Chris to ensure that he had a good experience, because there was some kind of relationship between the company and Chris's father. And then the final of the four is Paul, who's from a mixed class background. He had no history of higher education in the family, and he was one who almost just wanted to get work experience out of the way, get it done, tick it off, and then move on to the next thing. And we found that amongst some of the participants. He ended up in working with his grandfather in his grandfather's painting and decorating business. He was a sole trader, wasn't he? Yeah. He had worked with him from time to time in school holidays and the like, so he knew what he was doing, and he knew what he was going to get, in a sense, and he just saw it as a way of discharging this responsibility. So there's a degree of agency, in a sense, being demonstrated by him, but perhaps it wasn't as ambitious as we might have hoped. However, at Key Stage 5, and again remember this is a group of all of whom has gone on to university, so we're not claiming they're necessarily representative of kids at school at the time. These are the ones who made it and were successful in terms of economic educational outcomes. His ambitions by then had actually hardened and coalesced around a few key ideas, and so he sought out additional work experience, in a sense, from his own effort with a medical laboratory, and he, perhaps partly as a consequence of that, managed to secure a place at university where again he's studying biomedical sciences, despite having what he considered to be fairly disappointing A-level grades. So generally, as a kind of overview, we found little, in the way of the working class student experience, there was little evidence for the fact that these placements would inevitably be of low quality. In fact, for some of the working class students, it was actually through their own efforts, their own agency, they managed to secure some very positive and aspirational work experiences, which helped inform their choice to go to university and the type of thing to study there as well. However, as we suggested, this was largely through their own efforts. They didn't necessarily have the family links, the capital they could draw upon, and the school themselves weren't necessarily that helpful. I think there was a feeling from what some of them said that if the school saw they were getting on with it, that was one less worry for the school. They then turned to perhaps the harder to reach kids and to try and secure a placement for them. Only one student from the piece, 49, mentioned an external organisation, which was aimed higher. However, whilst generally the experiences were reasonably good, they weren't all positive. Some were still doing what we characterise as low quality placements with no or very little contact to education itself, and had and placements that perhaps had very little impact upon their choices in terms of what to do. Unless, of course, you can say, well, it helped harden their resolve not to do jobs like that, and to actually, it may have been an additional driver to actually go on and get to university. Now, in terms of the notion of social mobility and agency, there's evidence of work experience as a stepping stone into higher education for some of the young people. As we'd expect, the kind of structural constraints and systems generally favour the middle classes through their ability to employ higher quality social capital, for example. And then in some ways the higher status, the more exciting jobs that they may be characterised, were often dominated by middle classes, as we've seen, and the whole notion around things like internships and so on, and the BBC as a source of internships in the news not so long ago themselves. And there's been some interesting work. One of my colleagues, Kim Allen, has been doing some interesting work around undergraduate securing of internships in the media industries. However, generally speaking, many working class and mixed class students were able to exercise sufficient personal agency to secure the good placements that they sought. So, excuse me, in conclusion then, before we kind of pose a few questions, there's a mix of experience, less social class divide than for the general Key Stage 4 cohort. The future students, who again are in a sense a self-selecting group, they're perhaps slightly more motivated on average than a typical student, if there is such a thing, were more likely to demonstrate this sort of agency, but perhaps again there's the type of characteristics that will help you get into university in the first place. There's little support generally from schools, universities or other organisations. The most prestigious, most exciting placements are often restricted in practice to people with the social networks to be able to get their way in, get in through the door. And some academically able young people were missing out on the chance to have what we characterise as an aspirational work placement, something that would perhaps take them outside of their normal life or community or family experience. This is something we particularly felt we need systems to address this. So to finish with a couple of sort of future questions. Is the purpose of, or one of the potential purposes of work experience, be gearing people towards university, either in terms of raising aspirations, giving them suggestions as the type of career they may go into? To what extent should that be the case? How should we as a society, how should institutions, schools and so on, support the most capable and most motivated young people in seeking to find placements? How do we democratise the process? And again, this is part of what's behind the Milburn report and so on, which we referred to at the start, in terms of acquiring access to the top, most prestigious, hardest to obtain placements, and those that offer the greatest potential for social mobility. How can we open those up? And what role should universities themselves take in terms of securing and encouraging work experience? Okay, so we'll stop there as just a mention of the forthcoming article. It's in the Journal of Education and Work. Those of you who have a link through your organisations, you can click on there. We made the slides available there's the email addresses for Neil and I if you wish to pursue this and get in touch with us again. Okay, thank you.